The prisoner came out of the trees with both hands raised, not from a bunker, not from a city street, from the Vosges Mountains of eastern France in late October of 1944, where the forest was so thick that daylight arrived in broken pieces. He was cold, he was hungry, he had been fighting for days, and now, whatever war he thought he understood had narrowed down to one thing: stay alive. So he stepped down from his position, dropped into American hands, and looked at the soldiers who had taken him. Their faces were not what he expected. The men standing in front of him were Americans, but they were Japanese Americans. Nisei, sons of Japanese immigrants, soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion. And for decades, people have told a version of this moment as if the German prisoner said something unforgettable. Something like, "Who are you people?" It is a powerful story. Maybe too powerful. Because when you chase that quote through the record, when you look for the report, the diary, the named witness, the German sentence written down by someone who was there, the quote begins to disappear. What does not disappear is the unit. The prisoner's exact words are hard to prove. The men who captured him are not. They belong to one of the most decorated combat formations in the history of the United States Army. And they were fighting in Europe while many of their own parents, wives, brothers, and sisters were locked behind barbed wire by the country whose uniform they wore. That contradiction is not a side detail. It is the center of the story. Because the real question is not whether one German prisoner was shocked. The real question is what kind of country takes a man's family prisoner, puts a rifle in his hands, sends him across the ocean, and then discovers that he will fight so hard the record can barely hold the numbers. Before France, before the lost battalion, before the famous empty ranks on the review field, the story began in Hawaii. Before the war, many Japanese Americans in Hawaii were already serving in uniform. They were citizens by birth, young men from fishing families, farms, shops, docks, and sugar communities. Some were in the 298th and 299th Infantry Regiments of the Hawaiian National Guard. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. In one morning, suspicion swallowed loyalty. The same men who had been soldiers on Saturday were treated as potential enemies by Monday. Some had their weapons taken away. Some were looked at as if their faces had canceled their oath. Imagine that moment clearly. You are wearing your own country's uniform. You have sworn to defend it. And then your country quietly decides it cannot trust your hands around a rifle. The Army considered separating them. It considered using them for labor. It considered removing them from anything that looked like real combat. Instead, in 1942, more than 1,400 Hawaiian Nisei were gathered into a new unit and shipped away from the islands. They became the 100th Infantry Battalion. No regiment. No easy home in the Army's structure. A separate battalion, almost like an orphan unit. The men called it the One Puka Puka. Puka meant whole, or zero. One Puka Puka. 100. They trained at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, then at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. And they trained under a pressure most American soldiers never had to carry. They were not only preparing for the enemy, they were preparing for judgment. Every drill, every inspection, every mistake, they knew someone was watching and asking the same poisonous question. Can these men really be Americans? While they trained, the answer to that question was being written in another part of the country with guard towers and barbed wire. Under Executive Order 9066, roughly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forced from their homes on the West Coast. Most were American citizens. Families lost businesses, farms, boats, tools, houses, photographs, and ordinary lives. They were sent inland to places like Manzanar, Heart Mountain, Topaz, and Tule Lake. And then the government did something that still feels almost impossible to say plainly. It went into those camps and asked young men to volunteer for the army. The same country that had confined their families now asked them to fight for freedom overseas. That was the beginning of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, activated in February of 1943. The Army wanted volunteers. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans had not been imprisoned on the same mass scale, roughly 10,000 men stepped forward. The Army took only a fraction. On the mainland, inside the camps, the response was much smaller. How could it not be? A recruiter could stand before a young man and ask him to fight for America, while that young man's mother was still living behind wire because America had decided she was dangerous. Some volunteered anyway. Others refused. And history is smaller when it pretends only one of those choices was brave. The men who volunteered chose to prove their citizenship in blood. The men who resisted asked why citizenship needed to be proven at all. The 442nd took a motto from a Hawaiian gambling phrase: go for broke, bet everything on one roll, hold nothing back. At first it sounded like a slogan. Later it sounded like a warning. The 100th reached combat first. In September of 1943, it landed in Italy and entered the war near Salerno, attached to the 34th Infantry Division. Almost immediately, officers above them noticed something unusual. They were aggressive. They were disciplined. They pushed forward with a kind of intensity that did not look like ordinary ambition. Because for the men of the 100th, every yard had a second meaning. Taking a ridge was not just taking a ridge. It was an answer to the men who had taken their rifles away. It was an answer to the politicians who had locked up their families. It was an answer to everyone who had looked at an American citizen and seen an enemy face. But the answer was paid for in bodies. The 100th fought through Italy into the winter campaign and the brutal fighting around Monte Cassino. That place ground up infantry the way a mill grinds grain. The battalion had arrived with around 1,300 men. By the time Cassino fell in May of 1944, about 520 were left. In one original platoon of 40 men, only 5 remained standing. The unit earned a nickname no soldier wants: the Purple Heart Battalion. Not because of ceremony, because of wounds. Then the 442nd arrived from training and joined the fight. In June of 1944, the 100th was attached to the 442nd. Normally, a battalion folded into a regiment would lose its old identity and simply become the 1st Battalion. The 100th kept its name. That sounds like paperwork. It was not. It was the Army admitting that this battalion had already carved a name too deep to erase. Together, the 100th and the 442nd fought through central Italy, through places like Belvedere and Suvereto, pushing German forces north. They were no longer a question mark in American uniform. They were proven infantry. And then, in the autumn of 1944, they were sent to France. The Vosges were not open country. They were old, steep, wet mountains covered in dark forest. Artillery burst in the treetops and sent steel downward in sheets. Trails vanished in mud. Units lost contact yards apart. Men could hear the enemy before they could see him. The 442nd came under the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, commanded by Major General John Dahlquist. Within weeks, the regiment would become famous and nearly be destroyed. First came Bruyere. German defenders held the hills around the town in depth. The 442nd had to fight through one position, then another, then another. They took the town. They took the surrounding hills. They moved into Bifontaine. They were exhausted. They had earned relief. Instead, another order came. A battalion from the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Division, had pushed too far into the forest. German forces closed behind it. The Americans were trapped on a ridge, short of food, water, and ammunition. The newspapers would call them the Lost Battalion. About 275 men were surrounded. Other American units tried to reach them. They failed. Then Dahlquist turned to the Japanese-American regiment that had just been through days of punishing combat and ordered it back into the forest. Go get them out. The rescue took 5 days. The 442nd had to climb into prepared German positions in wet woods, often uphill, often through artillery already registered on the approaches. Shells hit branches overhead and turned the forest canopy into a weapon. Men learned that even the trees were dangerous. They moved by yards. They crawled. They charged. They dug in. They got up again. The arithmetic of that rescue is almost impossible to hear without stopping. To rescue the trapped Texans, the 442nd suffered more than 800 casualties. More men were killed or wounded in the rescue than were saved by it. 211 trapped Americans walked out alive. Over 800 Japanese American soldiers paid the price of opening that path. Company L went into the fight with 185 men. 8 came out without wounds. Company K entered with 186. By the end, 169 were dead or wounded. Those are not statistics in the abstract. Those are platoons reduced to shadows. Those are squads that disappeared. Those are men who had volunteered from Hawaii, from farms, from city blocks, and from prison camps, now lying in French leaves so another American unit could come home. When the first men of the 442nd reached the trapped battalion, one of the stories says Sergeant Mutt Sakamoto offered the exhausted Texans a cigarette. No speech, no monument line, just a cigarette in the middle of hell. The radio message sent back was simple. Patrol from the 442nd here. Tell them we love them. Afterward came one of the most repeated moments in the unit's history. General Dahlquist ordered the regiment to assemble so he could review and thank them. The survivors formed up. Dahlquist saw how few men were standing there and became angry. He thought the regiment had held men back. Where is everybody? An officer answered him. This is the regiment, sir. The rest are dead or in the hospital. That sentence does more than describe casualties. It shows how completely the unit had been spent. The 442nd began the war with roughly 4,000 men, but over the course of combat, it had to be replenished again and again. By some estimates, the regiment was replaced 2.5 to 3.5 times over. That does not describe a unit that merely fought hard. It describes a unit fed into the hardest places, rebuilt, and fed in again. Was that because commanders saw them as expendable? Was it because they were elite infantry and elite infantry get sent where the fire is worst? Historians still argue the question. Malice is difficult to prove, but the question is not insulting, it is necessary. Because a country that had already put their families behind wire does not get the benefit of easy innocence. Now return to the prisoner in the forest, the man with his hands up, the man who supposedly looked at the 442nd and gave history its perfect quote. This is where the record becomes stubborn. A phrase often attached to the unit says the Germans called them the little iron men. It is a strong phrase. It sounds like enemy respect. It fits the legend beautifully. But when you look for the German source, the original phrase, the captured document, the named veteran, the intelligence report, the foundation starts to weaken. The phrase appears mainly in American telling. So the careful version is not the Germans called them that. The careful version is Americans later said the Germans called them that. That difference matters because the 442nd does not need a borrowed German compliment to be great. The same problem surrounds the famous prisoner reaction. The image is easy to believe. A German soldier in France in 1944 had no obvious reason to expect Asian American infantry in the woods. He could easily have been startled. He could easily have asked who they were. Something like that may well have happened more than once. But possible is not the same as sourced. When the major histories of the unit are searched for the clean, quotable prisoner line, it does not appear in the way the legend promises. The official accounts do not give us a neat transcript. Oral history collections preserve thousands of memories, but not that one perfect German sentence in a form a historian can firmly point to. So the honest answer is this. German surprise is plausible. The exact famous quote is not secure. It lives in reputation, not in a document. And that is not a disappointment. It is an opening into something more interesting. Because the Germans facing the 442nd were not always the neat picture that memory imagines. Late in the war, German units in the Vosges could include men pulled from across occupied Europe. Poles, Russians, Croatians, and others pressed into a collapsing army. Some prisoners who surrendered to Japanese American soldiers may not have been German by nationality at all. So the face looking up from the mud might have belonged to a man just as far from home as the Nisei soldier standing over him. A war of empires had thrown both men into the same forest. And there is another documented mirror that the legend usually leaves out. At the same time the 442nd fought to reach the American Lost Battalion, a German battalion was also cut off in those woods, trying to survive and be relieved. Two lost battalions, one American, one German, both trapped in the same cold forest. That is not a clean slogan. It is better. It is war seen from both sides at once. There is also a real prisoner story worth keeping because it has something the famous quote lacks: a record. After one fight, German prisoners offered to help bury a fallen Japanese-American soldier. One Nisei sergeant was furious at the thought of enemy hands touching his friend's body. But at the graveside, the prisoners knelt and recited the Lord's Prayer in their own language. The line "history saved" was not an insult, not a shocked question, not enemy awe. It was a prayer over a man they had been trying to kill. That is harder to package and harder to forget. The men of the 442nd were not symbols first, they were men. Daniel Inouye was a young officer in E Company. In April of 1945, during the final push in Italy, he led an assault against German machine guns near Colle Musatello. He was shot in the stomach and kept going. A German grenade shattered his right arm while he was holding a grenade of his own. His arm was nearly torn away, but the grenade was still in his hand. He pried it loose with his other hand, threw it, and continued the attack. He lost the arm. He later became a United States Senator. Sadao Munamori was a private first class. In April of 1945, near Serovetsa, he knocked out German machine guns, then threw himself onto a grenade that landed among his comrades in a shell crater. He died saving them. For decades, he was the only 442nd soldier to receive the Medal of Honor. Barney Hajiro charged up ground near Bruyères that men remembered as Suicide Hill, destroyed machine gun positions, and had already helped capture most of an 18-man German patrol. George Sakato took command when leadership broke down and drove an attack forward during the Lost Battalion fight. Joe Nishimoto helped break a deadlock near La Houssière and was killed days later. James Okubo, a medic, crawled through fire again and again to reach wounded men when nobody else could. Young Oak Kim was Korean American, not Japanese American, and an officer in the 100th. When the Army suggested he might not belong among Japanese American soldiers because of the history between Korea and Japan, he refused to leave them. In that unit, he said, they were all Americans. At Anzio, he crawled hundreds of yards through dangerous ground to capture German sentries and bring back intelligence his unit needed. Those are the men the prisoner saw, not an ethnic surprise, not a slogan, not a useful myth. Men, and the numbers around them remained staggering. The 100th and 442nd became, for their size and length of service, the most decorated unit in United States Army history. They earned thousands of awards, 7 presidential unit citations, thousands upon thousands of Purple Hearts. One commonly repeated figure says the unit had a 314% casualty rate. That number needs care. It does not mean that more men died than ever served. It is a way of measuring wounds and replacements against the unit's combat strength, counting men wounded more than once and showing how often the formation was broken and rebuilt. The truth is severe enough without exaggeration. A unit can only reach a figure like that when it has been wounded over and over and over again. For half a century, another number told a different story. Only one Medal of Honor had been awarded to the 442nd during the war. One. Despite the casualties, despite the missions, despite the Distinguished Service Crosses that had piled up just below the nation's highest award. In the 1990s, the government reviewed whether Asian American soldiers had been denied full recognition because of discrimination. The answer was yes. In 2000, 20 Medals of Honor were presented to Asian American veterans of World War II. Most were upgrades from earlier awards. Most went to men of the 442nd and 100th. Many of the men were no longer alive to receive them. Valor did not change after 55 years. Only the country's willingness to name it did. But the story cannot belong only to those who volunteered. At Heart Mountain in Wyoming, imprisoned Japanese American men formed the Fair Play Committee. They did not say they were against serving forever. They asked how a government could draft them while denying their families the rights of citizens. Restore our rights, they argued, and then call us. Dozens were convicted of draft resistance. For years, even many Japanese American veterans saw them as disloyal. The wound inside the community lasted long after President Truman pardoned the resistors in 1947. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to force the story into one kind of courage. One man picked up a rifle to prove he was American. Another refused the rifle until America admitted he already was. Both were responding to the same insult, and the irony reached even farther than Europe. Thousands of Nisei served in the military intelligence service in the Pacific. They used Japanese language skills to interrogate prisoners, translate documents, read captured plans, and persuade enemy soldiers to surrender. They used the language of their parents and grandparents to defeat Imperial Japan, for a country that had imprisoned many of those same parents and grandparents. There is no simple feeling that fits that, only the fact. When the war ended, the welcome home was uneven. Some Nisei veterans returned to communities where signs still told them they were not wanted. Some veterans organizations were slow to admit them. Recognition came, but it came like a debt paid in installments after the creditors had grown old. President Truman reviewed the regiment in 1946 and told them they had fought not only the enemy, but prejudice. That line is remembered because it is true, but the fuller meaning is sharper. He was not just praising them, he was telling them the fight was not finished, because prejudice had not vanished when the uniforms came off. Hollywood tried to tell the story in 1951 with the film Go for Broke. It included real veterans. It captured pieces of the unit's world. It even showed some of the friction between Hawaii Nisei and mainland Nisei, a tension that changed when the Hawaii men saw the camps their mainland comrades had come from. But the film still filtered the story through a white officer's education. That was the doorway mainstream America seemed to require. Even a sympathetic version had to look at the Nisei from the outside first. Which brings the story back to the prisoner in the Vosges. An outsider, looking at their faces, trying to understand what stood in front of him. So what did German prisoners say when they learned their captors were Japanese American? The most honest answer is still the least convenient. We do not have the perfect quote. We have a legend. We have a plausible reaction. We have repeated memory. But we do not have the clean document that lets us put exact words into that prisoner's mouth. And the 442nd does not lose anything when we admit that, because the proof of who they were is not trapped inside a German sentence. It is in the dead and the wounded. It is in the 8 men of Company L who walked away unhurt. It is in the more than 800 casualties taken to rescue 211 trapped Americans. It is in the empty review field that made a general think men were missing when he was already looking at all who were left. It is in the medals delayed by prejudice. It is in the families behind wire. It is in the soldiers who volunteered and in the resistors who demanded rights before service. It is in the linguists in the Pacific fighting a war inside the language of their own ancestry. The myth wanted one German prisoner to say what the record already says louder, but history does not need that line. The men of the 100th and 442nd were doubted by their own country, tested by the German army, and measured in the hardest arithmetic war can produce. The prisoner may have been astonished. The record was not. The proof was never in his mouth. It was in the casualty lists.